Hi there. My name is Tanessa Franks, and I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in helping people overcome problems with social anxiety. If you're someone who deals with social anxiety that impacts your overall life satisfaction, perhaps you've had the experience of having social anxiety affect your work life, specifically your experience with job interviews. In this video, I want to give you 5 suggestions for managing social anxiety in your very next job interview. Before I jump into the suggestions though, I do want to say that job interviews are a stressful experience for most people. One study notes that 92% of Americans experience stress and anxiety during some part of the job interview experience. And the primary reason why job interviews are so stressful is because they trigger what's known as a fear of negative evaluation, basically a fear of being judged negatively. What we know about social anxiety is that a fear of negative evaluation, a fear of judgment, a fear of embarrassment is really at the heart of the social anxiety experience. So it's really not difficult to see why job interviews are a potentially difficult situation. Now, I really want to emphasize the importance of this topic. Research has consistently shown that folks who have social anxiety disorder, so social anxiety that impacts their day-to-day functioning, have significant impairments when it comes to their work life compared to folks who do not have social anxiety disorder. And some of these impairments include higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of underemployment, lower wages, and overall impairments in work performance. And so given that job interviews are sort of the gateway for almost all jobs in our society, this is an important topic. So if you're watching this video and you experience significant social anxiety, I want to share these 5 suggestions. Suggestion number 1 is to stop avoidance in its tracks. What we know about social anxiety is that avoidance is really the heartbeat of social anxiety. When you avoid a social situation that triggers anxiety, you get relief in the short term, you get that temporary relief, but overall it has a negative impact on your experience of anxiety in the long run. So when you avoid a social situation, you miss out on opportunities for new learning. You miss out on the chance to test out your assumptions and your predictions about the negative things that will happen when you're engaged in a social situation. One of the best ways for overcoming anxiety of all types really is to engage in what are called experiments or exposures. Those are common terms for practices that are used in cognitive behavioral therapy, where you intentionally engage in the situations that cause anxiety so that you give yourself those opportunities for new learning that I mentioned a moment ago. So in the case of job interviews, one of the best things that you can do is to go on more job interviews, to really give yourself an opportunity to practice. Your anxiety about job interviews will not decrease when you wait for the right time to go on an interview. In my work, I often talk about the pitfalls of waiting until you feel confident before you take a certain action. A lot of times people will wait until they are in the right mindset, or until they feel a certain emotion, or until they make a certain life change before they pursue an activity or a behavior that would be fulfilling for them. And what I often say is that you do not get confident and then take an action. Confidence really comes from taking action. So first you take an action and then you get confidence as a result. So in the case of a job interview, maybe you do your very next interview and maybe it doesn't go as well as you would like. So then you do another interview and you make some changes based on how the first one went. And maybe that one goes a little bit better. And then you schedule another one and maybe that one goes a little bit better than the second one. The idea is to try as much as possible to detach yourself from the outcome of the interview. When you're engaging in those experiments and exposures in a therapeutic setting, your goal really is to try and detach yourself yourself from the outcome. So you're not going on these interviews and considering it a success if you get the job. A success is really defined by your willingness to keep putting yourself in that position of doing the job interview, to keep showing up and taking action. Now, obviously, I know that work is a very critical part of your day-to-day life. So I'm not suggesting that the outcome doesn't matter at all. But what I am suggesting is that by going on more job interviews rather than fewer job interviews, you give yourself a chance to practice interviewing. You also give yourself an increased chance of getting a job, and you also take the pressure off of the need to get any one particular job. So I want you to set a goal here. If you've been searching for jobs and maybe you've been applying for 1 or 2 jobs a week, I want you to see if you can challenge yourself to apply for 5 jobs per week with the goal of getting more interviews. Even if a job is not a perfect match, pursue it anyway with the goal of getting that interview practice. Okay, suggestion number 2 is to revamp your interview beliefs. Now, what I'm talking about here are your thoughts or your underlying beliefs about your ability to do well in a job interview. I want to encourage you here to take some time to think about what your underlying beliefs are about your job interview skills. Perhaps you have thoughts such as, I'm never going to get a new job because I'm not as qualified as the other candidates. Or when I get in that job interview, I'm probably going to stumble over my words and make a fool of myself. Or perhaps you have the thought of, all the other candidates are smarter than I am, and there is no way that I can compete for the same job as they are. Now, those are just examples, but you can see in those examples that none of those thoughts, none of those beliefs would really serve a person well in their goal of showing up on a job interview and really doing their best. And in most cases, even though those thoughts feel very real, they are not accurate and they don't really reflect the reality of a person's situation. So here's what I want you to know. Your beliefs about your ability to do well in an interview are dynamic and they can be changed. So I want to challenge you here to come up with a more balanced assessment, a more balanced belief about your job interview skills. Now, you don't need to attach your thoughts and your assessment to a certain outcome. So something like, I'm going to do great in the interview and I'm definitely going to get the job is not really what you're aiming for here. But what you do want to do is to come up with something that helps to push you toward your goal of showing up and doing your best. So a more balanced assessment or a more balanced thought might be something along the lines of, I have the ability to show up and communicate clearly about my skills and my background. That's an example of a thought that will help you to move past your anxiety and move towards your goal of showing up, as opposed to some of those first examples that I gave, which are more likely to pull you into your experience of anxiety and more likely to lead to avoidance, which is not what we want to do. Okay, moving on to suggestion number 3. I want you to watch, try, and learn. After you're on board with applying for more jobs and getting more job interviews, I want you to take this suggestion as another way to help change your beliefs about your ability to do well in a job interview. And so for this suggestion, I actually have 2 options that I want you to choose from. For the first option, I want you to consider engaging in some vicarious learning, also known as watching other people do well in a job interview. So if watching videos sounds like it would work well for you, I want you to simply do a Google search for video demonstrations of good job interviews and search through the results that you come up with. Or if you want a shortcut to an option, you can check out the YouTube channel of The Interview Guys. They have videos with demonstrations of good job interview responses. They also have videos for how to prepare for job interviews. Lots of content there that you can watch. But what you're specifically looking for are videos that show people, real life people, answering interview questions so that you can watch, learn, and start to internalize some of what it looks like to answer interview questions questions well. And then for the second option, I want you to consider engaging in job interview role plays. And so for this, you can simply ask a family member or a friend if they would be willing to engage in this role play with you. You want to ask them to maybe spend 20-30 minutes in the role play. They can come up with some questions that would be appropriate for your job field. And I want you to really try and make this as real as possible. So dress up in whatever clothes you would normally wear during an interview. I want you to show up, putting your best foot forward, and really take the role play seriously. Now, you might be thinking, can engaging in role plays really help me if it's not the real thing? And the answer is yes. Role plays can be a very effective strategy for helping you get practice with thinking through your responses to interview questions and articulating those responses. And even if it doesn't trigger the same level of anxiety that you would have if it were a real interview, those skills and that practice that you get can definitely transfer from the role play to the real life interview once you're there. Now, both of these strategies, watching videos and engaging in role plays, were suggested decades ago by a very well-known psychologist by the name of Albert Bandura as ways to increase what's known as your self-efficacy about job interviews. So essentially, your beliefs and your ability to do well in a job interview. On to suggestion number 4. I want you to get out of your head. Let's say that you've been going on more job interviews, you've been really working on changing your beliefs about your ability to interview well, and you've been watching videos or you've been engaging in role plays, and now it's time for the interview. When you're in the waiting room, waiting for the interviewer to come and call you back to get started, I want you to be intentional about focusing outward rather than inward. Research shows that folks who deal with problematic social anxiety tend to focus more internally rather than externally when they're anxious. So this means focusing on things like your anxious thoughts or your racing heart, your tightness in your chest, your trembling hands, rather than focusing externally on things like the person that you're engaged in a conversation with. So when you're waiting for your interview to start, I want you to make a note to yourself to try and notice your surroundings. Really try to put your attention on the external. Like, what does the room smell like? What are some of the sounds that you hear? What are some of the different colors that you see in your environment? These are all ways to try and intentionally put your attention on the external rather than the internal. This follows from the work of a psychologist by the name of David Clark, who writes and does a lot of research on a practice called attention training, where you intentionally work with folks who have social anxiety to help them practice this more external versus internal focus when they're engaged in social situations. And it has 2 primary benefits. Number 1, it's been shown to reduce anxiety, even though it might not seem like it, and it leads to more fulfilling interactions because you're more engaged in the conversations and the experiences that you're having in the moment. So I definitely want you to try shifting to a more external versus internal focus when you're in your next job interview. All right, suggestion number 5, share. This one is all about engaging in self-disclosure or the practice of sharing more personal information. When we're anxious, we tend to offer shorter responses and we tend to offer up less information about ourselves, about our thoughts, about our experiences, and this can be problematic for all sorts of situations and all sorts of relationships, but it can be particularly problematic in a job interview setting where one of your primary goals is to share information about your skills, about your background, about your knowledge, and to really communicate to the interviewer that you are the best match for a particular job. So for this suggestion, I really like the idea of making a brief note with a list of the top 5 skills or abilities that you want to make sure you share with the interviewer. And the number is really really not important. It can be 5 things, it can be 6, it can be 3. The idea is just to have a very brief list that you take with you to your interview and that you make a goal of glancing at some point during the interview so that you can make sure that you have shared all of the items that you wanted to be sure to share. Having that list is a way to make sure that you're engaging in self-disclosure and that you're weaving those skills, those accomplishments into your responses as you go along. And yes, it's perfectly okay to glance at your notes during the interview. All right, so there you have it. My 5 suggestions are to go on more interviews because avoidance does not serve you well when it comes to getting the job that you want, to practice changing your thoughts and your beliefs about your ability to do well in a job interview. I want you to choose to either watch videos and or engage in role plays as another way to change your beliefs about your ability to do well and to get more practice. I also want you to be intentional about focusing your attention externally rather than internally. And then finally, I want you to be very intentional about engaging in self-disclosure during your interview. Social anxiety and job interview anxiety can be improved. Like anything, it takes practice. And I sincerely hope that you can put 1, 2, or all of these suggestions to use and go after the job that you truly want. Thank you for watching and best wishes.